Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of J.S. Bach's chorale harmonizations. Today we're looking at meinen Jesum, ich nicht, which translates to I shall not leave my Jesus. This is a pretty interesting chorale, lots of twists and turns throughout. We're going to talk about it as we go through it. Start things off, two sharps in the key signature. We start on D major, we end on D major. I reckon we're in the key of D major. We have two passing tones afterwards, one in the alto and one in the bass before we get F sharp, A, D, and A. That's D major in first inversion, so we'll just change the figured bass. And then we get D, F sharp, D, and A off of the harmonic rhythm, which is like taking the chord and putting it back in root position because the third that would otherwise be lost by skipping a third down in the bass is replaced by the tenor. So that's pretty cool. We don't often see that. In many cases, we just have a skip in the bass, leaving an open fifth across the rest of the voices. So this isn't the only time this occurs as well. But we do see the configuration I did just talk about where only the bass moves in the chorale as well. Lots of activity in this bass line. We then have G, G, D, and B. That is G major in root position, which is a 4 chord, passing 7th in the bass. This B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. We then have E, E, G, and B. That's E minor in root position. That is a 2 chord. 4 going to 2 is kind of an interesting progression, but we do see it with some regularity. Passing 7th in the tenor, passing tone in the alto before we get A, C sharp, E, and C sharp. That's A major in root position. And then we have an interesting cadence that we have seen in a prior episode. I can't tell you which one. It might actually be the meinen Jesum, ich nicht that we last looked at that had this very interesting perfect authentic cadence in it that consisted of a 5 chord that stepped down in a scalar fashion in the bass that resulted in us having a very interesting tonic chord. So we have passing tones going on in the lower voices here after our 5 chord. Then we have F sharp, A, and C sharp. Now, if we analyze that literally, that's a 3 chord, but I think this F sharp and this A right here, they're accented non-chord tones, and what's actually being implied here is E, A, G, and C sharp, which is A7 over E, which would be just taking our 5 chord and turning it into 5, 4, 3. Before we go to 1, D, A, F sharp, and D, because you'd be hard-pressed to convince me that this does not sound like an authentic cadence. This does not sound like a 5-3-1 progression, which would be very fascinating, but the fact that we can extrapolate another dominant chord from the notes on the beat preceding our tonic triad makes me feel like that's really the chord that's being heard here. As we know, or if you've watched my videos in the past or know anything about the chorales, Bach tends to get the most contrapuntal in cadential situations. But looking ahead, we do have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of A major, and I think we pretty much modulate straight away from the beginning here. We have C sharp, A, and E, which is A major in first inversion. That would be 5, 6 in the key of D major, and in the key of A major, that would be our tonic triad in first inversion. Following this tonic triad, we have kind of an interesting progression. We have E, C sharp, G sharp, and E with a couple of passing tones going on following it. I do think this is a 1 to 3 progression. It's kind of interesting because 1 and 3 share a function. They're both sort of tonic functioning chords in terms of their stability. They share more notes than they don't share. And seeing 1 go to 3, it's probably the most uncommon chord we see our tonic go to, I think for that reason, because it's less of a progression and more of like a static restating of chords, because really this sort of just seems like taking our A major triad and inverting it again to second inversion, but instead of having A, we have G sharp, and then it kind of goes to A here, which kind of feels like we're hinting at the idea of A major happening here, but it's not what it sounds like with the supporting voices. I am pretty convinced that this is a 3 chord, also further justified by the fact that off the harmonic rhythm we have F sharp, C sharp, A, and E, which is F sharp minor 7. That's a 6-7 chord, and 3 wants to go to 6 via the cycle of falling fifths. So it's good that that's happening there. I think this is just a subdivision of the harmonic rhythm, and if it was not implied intentionally by Bach, which it likely was, it was a happy coincidence for us to happen upon our analyses hundreds of years after the fact. We then have G sharp, B, B, and D. That's G sharp diminished in root position, which would be a 7 chord. And then we have some more passing tones in the bass that kind of hint at the idea of A major, A and C sharp respectively, which are the root and the third of an A major triad. But with the B and the D above that, we can't really analyze the chord, but we can talk about it. We then have B, D, F sharp, and D, and if we analyze this literally, this is a 2 chord. However, I feel like I don't hear a 2 chord after this. What I hear is more of like, actually, we could make the same argument that this is a 2 chord. I'm going to walk that back. I feel like this is just a long subdivision of the harmonic rhythm here. We have 7 going to 2, which is a bit of a deceptive progression because 7 and 2, in the same way that 1 and 3 are seldom seen next to one another, 7 and 2 are seldom seen next to one another, not because they share a function, but rather because they share a bunch of notes in common. 2 out of 3 of their triadic notes are shared, so seeing this progression is more so, I feel like, a byproduct of it being a new sort of chapter, like a new leg of the progression. Like if we saw the progression as 1, 6, 3, 6, 7, then we have 2, 5, that would inevitably arrive at 1, which it's going to do. And when I say 5, haven't quite gotten to 5 yet, but if you look on at the non-chord tones here, we have G sharp, B is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. E is not a chord tone, so we will mark it. And this D, of course, is a chord tone. We have G sharp, B, E, and D, which is E7 over G sharp. That's a 5-6-5 chord. And we have 2-6-5-5-1. Just this 7. This 7's resolution is delayed until the next measure, A, C sharp, E, and C sharp, which is A major, our tonic triad. We have some passing tones. We have a passing tone, or more specifically, a passing 7th in the bass and a neighbor tone in the melody before we get F sharp, A, and C sharp. That is F sharp minor in root position. That's a 6 chord with a passing 7th in the bass. And this D is also a non-chord tone. I think it's called an escape tone when you step into it and skip out of it or leap out of it. Regardless, we have D, F sharp, A, and B happening on the next beat, which is B minor 7 over D, which is 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. We then have E, E, G sharp, and B. That is a 5 chord, E major, which is our dominant. Passing 7th in the tenor before we get A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. Looking ahead, we have a short phrase that ends in an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, and I think we modulate straight away from the key of A major. Sorry, I was thinking A major, which is why I wrote it. We're modulating straight away to the key of D major, where A major is now our dominant. Following our dominant, we have D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic D major. Passing 7th in the bass, we have B, D, F sharp, and A. That's B minor 7 root position. That is 6-7. I guess you could also make the argument that this A is our chord tone, and this is actually just 1 turning into 6-4, A, D, F sharp, and A, which would be a passing 6-4 chord. But that's not really how I hear it, with this B happening on the strong beat, like unlike some of the other chords where the chord tone does really feel like it's being introduced off of the harmonic rhythm. But after our 6-7 chord, we have G, D, G, and B. That's G major in root position, which is our 4 chord. Another passing 7th in the bass before we get E, E, G, and B. That's E minor in root position. That's a 2 chord. We have this thirds progression, 1 to 6 to 4 to 2, which is one way to exhaust the scale, a diatonic scale, without seeing repeats, right? Because if you go by thirds, we have 1, 6, 4, 2, 7, 5, 3, 1, which is one way to get there, but it doesn't get to the tonic via the dominant, which is what really creates that narrative structure that tonal composers relied upon for hundreds of years. So it's interesting that we're seeing a little fragment like this in the chorale. Regardless, we have a passing 7th in the bass and a passing tone in the alto before we get C sharp, A, E, and A. He takes this thirds progression and turns it, and once he gets to 2, he starts seeing red and starts going towards the cadence, because we get a 5 chord here, C sharp, A, and A. That's A major in first inversion, which is our dominant. Neighbor tones in the alto and the bass before we get C sharp, A, E, and G, which is taking our A major chord in first inversion, turning it into A7 over C sharp, which would be 7, 6, 5. And then we have A and C sharp happening here, which would be like the equivalent of taking the chord and putting it in root position. A, C sharp, and G. It would be incomplete, so we would have the 7 here, but no 5th. So this would just be like taking it and turning it into like a 7-3 chord. And then we get our D major chord, D, A, D, and F sharp, which is our tonic triad in root position. Okay, looking ahead, we have the complement to this imperfect authentic cadence. It is a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, no modulation. Even though we see some chromaticism here, that's just a secondary dominant. We start off the phrase with F sharp minor, F sharp, A, C sharp, and A. And actually, I'm going to comment on this because we have another 1 chord going to a 3 chord. I'd say that the most common instance in which we see 1 going to 3 is in situations where the previous phrase ended on a tonic, which phrases often do, and then we get a 3 to start the next phrase. Sometimes we see half cadences that go to 3, sometimes we see authentic cadences that go to 3, but I don't think this is the same as seeing a 1 chord go to a 3 chord. Or where is it? It is right here. 1 chord go to a 3 chord in the middle of a phrase. This has a little bit more of an like that static progression effect, whereas this one is following a phrase that has ended. The 3 feels like the beginning of a new sentence, so it doesn't have the same effect, but it still looks that way on the page. Our F sharp minor triad is followed by 2 passing tones, one of them being a passing 7th on the bass. And then we have D sharp, F sharp, D sharp, F sharp, B, and A, which is B7 over D sharp. That would be a secondary dominant, more specifically 5, 6, 5 of 2, because B is the dominant of E, and E is our supertonic, or our 2. And this B is kind of like taking the chord and putting it in root position, but because we're getting rid of the third of the chord in like the context of a major triad, or a chord that has a major or minor triad as its foundation, I don't think it's really worth analyzing. It's because it creates like an open 5th, which is an androgynous chord. We don't know the quality of it, although we could just assume that it is major because the third is part of the same beat, or the same whole beat, if we're just looking at a quarter note as the beat and the 8th notes being part of the same gesture. But looking ahead, we have on the next system E, G, B, and G. That's where our 5, 6, 5 chord, a 5, 6, 5 of 2 wants to go. That's E minor in root position. Passing 7th on the bass, we then get C sharp, A, E, and G. That's A7 in first inversion, 5, 6, 5, A7 over C sharp. This A, for the same reason, is kind of like turning it into root position, but we're getting rid of the third of the chord, so I don't really think it's worth analyzing, but we can talk about it. And then we have D, A, E, and F sharp, and I think that there are 2 different ways that we can analyze this. One is if we look at this D, and this is how I'm going to choose to analyze it. If we look at this D and this F sharp as accented non-chord tones, and we instead have C sharp, A, E, and E, that would be an A major triad over C sharp. That'd be like taking the chord and turning it into an 8-6, or just a first inversion triad, removing the 7th. But if we look at D, A, and F sharp, I think you could make the argument that this is a tonic triad with a 9/8 suspension over the bass, where this E is functioning like our 9/8 suspension that resolves on the next beat. However, as Bach often does, that suspension is interrupted by a new chord, B, D, D, and F sharp, which is B minor, which is our 6th chord. We have a passing tone in the bass, or more specifically a passing 7th. We also have a passing tone in the tenor and an escape tone in the melody. And if we look at all the notes there, we have A, C sharp, and G. We have the makings of an A7 chord here, but we don't have it in an entirety because D is here, which would be like an interesting sustained tone that gets in the way of the chord being entirely intact, despite 6 often being used as a predominant chord. After our 6th chord, however, we do have G, B, D, and E, which is E minor 7 over G. 6 wants to go to 2 anyways, and we know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, and as we're closing in on a cadence, this is a likely candidate for the chord that we would get 2 beats before our cadence. We follow that 2-6-5 chord up with A, C sharp, and E. That's A major in root position, or our 5 chord, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on D major, D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad root position. Interestingly, we take a turn from D major to the key of F sharp minor, and we cadence in the key of F sharp minor. It's an imperfect authentic cadence at the end of this phrase, and I think we modulate pretty much straight away. We start off with a B minor triad, B, B, F sharp, and D. That's our 6 chord, but in the key of F sharp minor, it's also our 4 chord. We have some passing tones in the bass, almost like we have a similar bass line as our second phrase, but also like our third phrase as well, just in the opposite direction. But this actually looks a lot more like our second phrase, almost exactly like our second phrase, just transposed to the key of F sharp minor rather than the key of A major. And F sharp minor is the complement to A major. They're relative to one another. So that's, I think, the comparison that's happening. This is just a variation on the second phrase. So that's pretty cool. We have D, B, F sharp, and D, which is just taking that B minor triad and inverting it once. So we'll just change the figured bass to reflect first inversion. Another passing tone in the bass before we get F sharp, B, F sharp, and C. I do think that this F sharp is an accent and non-chord tone, as well as this F sharp right here. I guess you could kind of call it like a, it's not really a suspension, even though it's kind of operating like one, but the bass changes to really make it what it is. But as you can see, this it looks like a suspension if we had redacted the bass, but the bass being intact, the fact that the alto and the bass share a tone and they both converge in this with the G sharp and the E sharp really emphasizing F sharp minor. This is about the cutoff point that I would say, you know what, I'm gonna walk this back, because I usually mark modulations as late as the new chord is introduced. So both of these chords are B minors. We have no reason to believe that we've modulated until we start to see the chromatic tones. So I'm going to say that instead of modulating over this beat, we're going to modulate over this beat, just to stay consistent with my previous analyses, even though you could make the argument that the modulation starts as early as the first phrase. It could even start as early as the D major chord, if you will it that way, but I don't really think it's super important. It's definitely a zone in which the modulation occurs, and the latest it happens, I think, is the third beat of this measure. But this G sharp, this B, this E sharp, and this C sharp spells out C sharp 7 over G sharp, which would be a 5-4-3 chord. At least that's the way that I see it. And then we get F sharp minor on the beat afterwards, A, F sharp, and C sharp, which is our tonic triad in first inversion. And then we skip down in the bass, but this is like saying our triads in root position afterwards, F sharp, A, F sharp, and C sharp. So we could change the figure bass to reflect that on the page as well. And as we're closing in on our cadence, we have G sharp, B, F sharp, and B. That would be like a G sharp. There should be a D in here, shouldn't there? Yeah, we kind of get the D happening here, but typically speaking, we would expect a 2-6-5 chord here, but instead we're getting a 2 half diminished 7th chord if we include the F sharp here, the D here, and this E is very brief, but an F sharp shares the same beat as this E, so I feel like this E is just, like I mentioned earlier, a counterpoint. As we get into cadences, the counterpoint is very strong. So I feel like a 2 half diminished 7th chord is being implied here, despite the fact that the third is missing from the downbeat. It is incorporated into the and of that beat, and this E sharp is just a contrapuntal gesture. We then get E sharp, C sharp, G sharp, and B. That's like a C sharp major, or sorry, a C sharp 7 chord over E sharp, which would be 5-6-5. That kind of gets turned into root position on the and of the beat. We have C sharp, E, and B, we're missing the G sharp, but regardless, we can change the figured bass to reflect that just by saying 7-3. Or I guess you can call it 8-7-3 as well, but I'm just going to call it 7-3 because the outermost interval is a seventh. Not that that super matters when you're writing figure bass. What matters is that the structure of the chord is matching, and I feel like both analyses are apt at articulating that. And of course our cadential chord is F sharp minor, F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A, which is our tonic triad in root position. And as we close out this chorale, we end in a perfect authentic cadence, and I think we pretty much modulate straight away. We have F sharp, A, F sharp, and A, or F sharp, C sharp, F sharp, and A. Apologies. I think this tonic triad is now our mediant in the key of D major, with a passing seventh on the bass as well. We then get D sharp, B, F sharp, and A. We've seen this chord in the past. This would be a secondary dominant, B7 over D sharp, and here we have 5-6-5 of 2. Again, it's functioning the same way. And we also have another 1 chord going to a 3 chord here. But again, this isn't like 2 chords that are separate. These are actually the same chord, just one is being analyzed as 1 and one is being analyzed as 3, unlike this progression right here where we have a 1 chord literally going to a 3 chord and a 1 chord literally going to a 3 chord here encompassed in the same phrase. So this just looks like 1 to 3 on the page, but this is also the same chord as the chord that precedes it. But with this B kind of turns the chord into root position, but we've talked about that. If we're getting rid of the third, I'm not going to analyze it because it's just an open fifth and we don't know the quality of the chord. Logically we infer that it's a major triad, but still the fact that the chord is not entirely intact on the new beat doesn't make it feel like a progression. We then have E, B, E, and G. That's E minor. That's where we would expect a 5-6-5 of 2 to go. And then we have G, B, E, and G, which is like an E minor triad in first inversion, fully intact, so we'll mark that as a progression. We then have B, B, D, and F sharp. That is B minor in root position. 2 going to 6, that's a transitive progression. We typically expect 6 to go to 2, but you could use the same voice leading to go in either direction. It just one takes you further away from the dominant, or takes you in the direction of approaching the dominant from a different direction. In this case, 5 or 6 can very well go to the dominant just as much as 2 can. So this is just a different angle of trajectory to approach the dominant. But it's interesting because he is just going to immediately go right back to our 2 chord on the next beat after this passing seventh on the bass. We have G, B, D, and E, which is E minor 7 in first inversion, 2-6-5. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords. This E is kind of like putting the chord in root position, but we just talked about that. I'm not going to analyze it if the third is taken out of the chord. Our penultimate chord is A, C sharp, and E. That's A major in root position, or our dominant. We have an anticipation here in the melody. This A and this E are both chord tones, so we don't need to mark them. And then we have D, F sharp, A, and D, which is our tonic triad in root position. And that concludes today's analysis. A relatively dense chorale, I'd say like a 7 out of 10 on the density scale, because we have some sections that do have some pretty hefty subdivision of the harmonic rhythm. But there was just a lot to talk about in terms of different interpretation of chords. I thought this moment was very interesting where we have D, A, E, and F sharp that resolves to like a 6 chord. I think that there are different ways that we could analyze what's going on here. It just depends on your relationship with the harmony and how you hear it. Always follow your ear. That's how I start off all of my analyses, is just by listening and having it inform my decision making. But all in all, fairly straightforward chorale, not the most straightforward, but fairly. I wasn't stumped really in any cases. I just was torn between different choices, and if you've watched my videos in the past, instead of purely committing to one and writing another off, I'll provide different viewpoints, and I will write multiple on the page if I feel like both are equally or somewhat equally valid or comparable to one another. But on that note, if you are interested in following me along on this journey to analyze all of the chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification icon. You'll be notified of when my video goes live, and I upload once daily. So if you want your daily fix of analysis or your daily dose of Bach, or both, you're definitely in the right place for the foreseeable future, as there are hundreds of chorales left to analyze that I am very excited to look at, and I hope that you will be there for the journey if it so interests you. But that being said, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.